2 in the afternoon, the 26th of January, 1945, a stretch of frozen ground outside a French village called Holtzwihr. A 20-year-old lieutenant named Audie Murphy is standing in a shallow ditch with a field telephone in one hand, watching 6 German tanks and roughly 250 infantrymen come out of the tree line toward him. His company has already been ordered back into the woods. He has stayed. His carbine runs dry within minutes, and there is nothing left to fight with except what is burning 20 yards behind him, an American tank destroyer, hit and on fire, its crew gone, its fuel and ammunition still inside it, and mounted on its turret, untouched by the flames so far, a single machine gun chambered for a round nearly half an inch across. Murphy climbs onto the hull of a vehicle that could explode at any second and puts his hands on the grips. What happens in the next hour will end with a Medal of Honor citation, but it will not end there, not for him, and not for the weapon in his hands. That weapon had already been feared, quietly and specifically, by German soldiers on every front of the war, in the air over Bremen and Schweinfurt, on the beaches of Normandy, in the hedgerows and the Ardennes snow, for reasons that had nothing to do with any one man's courage and everything to do with a decision made by an old army general almost 30 years earlier. Within 2 years of this afternoon in the snow, the branch of the German military that had once ruled the skies of Europe would be unable to put a formation into daylight without being cut apart by that gun, and the doctrine built around it. How that happened, how a single machine gun became the weapon German soldiers said they feared more than any other the Americans carried, starts not with Murphy, and not even with a battlefield, but with a piece of enemy hardware the U.S. Army captured in the last year of the First World War, and a 62-year-old gunsmith who was asked to build something bigger than anything he had made before. To understand why that gun mattered, you first have to understand what German infantry doctrine did to the men who faced it, because the reversal only means something if the threat was real, and by the middle years of the war it was. The German army built its entire small unit tactics around the machine gun, not the rifle. Where American doctrine treated the rifleman as the primary weapon and the machine gun as support, German doctrine flipped that arrangement. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 were the squad's main firepower, and everyone else, riflemen, grenadiers, even the squad leader, existed to protect, feed, and reposition the gun. The MG-42 alone could put out somewhere near 1,200 rounds a minute, a rate of fire so fast that individual shots blurred into a single continuous tearing sound, a sound American soldiers nicknamed the buzz saw, and the Germans themselves called the bone saw. The psychological effect on green troops was severe enough that the War Department produced an entire training film just to talk soldiers down from their fear of it, a film that ended, almost pleadingly, by telling recruits the gun's bark was worse than its bite. Combined with disciplined interlocking fields of fire, mortar teams pre-registered on obvious approach routes, an armor that by 1944 still outgunned most of what the Allies fielded gun for gun, the German infantry position was not a myth built up by frightened replacements. It was a machine for killing men who advanced the way American doctrine told them to advance. And for 2 years, Kasserine, Sicily, the hedgerows of Normandy, that machine worked. American after-action reports from Normandy in particular described entire platoons pinned for hours by a single well-sighted MG-42 team, unable to locate the gun's exact position through the sound alone, because the rate of fire scrambled a listener's sense of direction. Veterans of that fighting remembered the gun less as a specific danger to plan around than as a constant, ambient threat that shaped every decision about where to walk, where to dig, and how long to stay in any one place. Respecting that threat honestly matters here, because everything that follows in this story is only impressive in proportion to how real that danger was. The problem was that American infantry kept trying to answer German firepower with more of the same kind of firepower, and it kept costing them. Early in the war, the standard American answer to a German machine gun nest was the same one every army had used since 1918. Suppress it with rifle and bar fire, flank it, and finish it with grenades. A tactic that assumed the defender's gun would eventually run dry or the attacker would get close enough to matter. And against a weapon firing twice the rate of anything the U.S. Army carried. Eventually, and close enough, both arrived too late for a great many men. The standard-issue Browning .30 caliber, air-cooled and belt-fed, was a reliable weapon, but it fired a round designed for shooting other riflemen, not for punching through the timber and packed earth of a German bunker, not for reaching out past 600 yards with authority, and not for doing anything at all to the light armored cars and half-tracks the Wehrmacht used to screen its infantry. American commanders who had fought in France a generation earlier remembered a related problem from that war, that infantry, tanks, and aircraft too often had no weapon in common, nothing that worked equally well mounted on a truck, bolted to a tripod, or hung under an airplane wing. Every partial fix multiplied logistics without closing the actual gap in stopping power. What the U.S. Army needed, and did not yet have, was a single weapon powerful enough to answer a bunker, an armored car, and a low-flying aircraft with the same belt of ammunition. And that requirement would not be filled until the very end of the war that first exposed it. The opening came from an unlikely source, a rifle the Germans built to solve a completely different problem, and then lost. In 1917, German engineers, desperate to stop the new British and French tanks crawling across no man's land, built an oversized bolt-action anti-tank rifle called the Holtzwihr, firing a 13mm round with enough velocity to punch through the thin steel of early armor. It was clumsy, brutally hard to shoot, and produced in only modest numbers, but a handful of the weapons, along with stocks of their ammunition, fell into American hands before the armistice. American ordnance officers studied the German round closely because it did something no American cartridge could do. It moved fast enough, over 2,700 feet per second, to defeat armor at real combat range. That single captured detail, a number lifted directly from a weapon the Germans themselves would abandon, became the target specification for the American gun that would haunt German soldiers a generation later. The weakness in the enemy's position was stated plainly. Once the number was in American hands, nobody else on either side had a man-portable weapon that could match it. The man who received that specification was John Moses Browning, already 62 years old and the most successful firearms designer in American history, credited by then with the autoloading pistol that became the M1911. The machine gun that had armed a generation of American riflemen, and more than 100 other patents. In April of 1918, at the personal insistence of General John J. Pershing, the Army asked Browning for a weapon that could throw a half-inch bullet at that same murderous velocity, big enough to kill an early tank, and though almost nobody said this part out loud yet, big enough to reach the new all-metal aircraft the Germans were starting to build. Machines like the Junkers JI with an armored belly that simple rifle rounds could no longer punch through. Browning did what he had done throughout his career. Instead of inventing something from nothing, he scaled up a design that already worked. He took his own M1917 water-cooled .30 caliber gun, still one of the most reliable machine guns in the world, and enlarged it. Same basic action, same short recoil operating principle, same overall silhouette, but built around a cartridge more than 3 times as powerful. Winchester handled the ammunition, working the captured German ballistics into an American case nearly 4 inches long, and by October of 1918, 1 month before the armistice, the first prototype was on the test range. It fired too slowly, its muzzle velocity fell short of what Pershing had demanded, and the war ended before it could be finished. For most weapons, that would have been the end of the story, a promising prototype, overtaken by peace, quietly filed away. This one was not filed away. It was too good an idea to let die, and over the following decade Browning, working now with Colt, refined the design until it entered limited U.S. service in the early 1920s, officially adopted under its lasting designation in 1933. The M2, the second Browning heavy machine gun, soon carrying a nickname that would outlive nearly everyone who gave it to her, Ma Deuce. What made Ma Deuce different from every comparable weapon on either side was not any single specification. Belt-fed, air-cooled, firing from a closed bolt at somewhere between 450 and 600 rounds a minute, depending on configuration, with an effective range past a mile and a muzzle velocity near 3,000 feet per second. None of those numbers alone would have terrified German infantry. What terrified them was where the gun showed up. The same weapon, essentially unchanged, rode on the wings of American fighters and bristled from the turrets of heavy bombers. It sat twinned on half-tracks and quadrupled on the M-16 anti-aircraft carriage soldiers called the meat chopper. It was welded to the decks of landing craft, bolted to jeeps, mounted coaxially and on the cupolas of Sherman tanks, and carried on ground tripods by infantry heavy weapons platoons. A German soldier who survived a strafing run from a P-47 could walk 2 miles inland and be killed by the identical gun firing from a half-track. There was no front, no branch of service, no hour of the day where the weapon was absent, and that ubiquity, not the muzzle velocity, not the rate of fire, was the true weapon. American factories built roughly 2 million of them during the war. The men who carried it into combat came to trust it in a way soldiers rarely trust machinery. It was heavy, at over 80 pounds for the gun alone before mounting hardware, difficult to move by hand, and almost impossible to break through neglect, misuse, or the accumulated abuse of a long campaign. The kind of weapon that worked when everything around it had stopped working. That was loop 1, the mechanism, and its full answer was not really the gun at all. It was the doctrine built around it, a doctrine American planners never wrote down as a single unified idea, but that emerged from 100 separate decisions across the Army and Army Air Forces, all pointing the same direction. Where the German Army concentrated its firepower doctrine around one weapon type used one way, the American approach put the same weapon on every kind of platform and let each service branch adapt it to its own tactical problem. Bomber crews used massed, overlapping fields of fire from a dozen guns per aircraft to make an unescorted formation survivable against fighter attack. A defensive doctrine the Memphis Belle and hundreds of aircraft like her depended on, carrying as many as 13 of the guns in a single airframe. Armored cavalry used it for reconnaissance by fire, hosing suspected ambush positions before infantry had to walk into them. Infantry heavy weapons companies used it at long range to suppress German machine gun nests from outside the effective range of German small arms, buying riflemen the seconds they needed to maneuver, solving, at last, the exact problem that had gotten so many Americans killed earlier in the war. The underlying logic, boiled down to something a soldier could actually carry into a fight and repeat to the next man, was simple. Don't try to outshoot a German machine gunner at his own range with a weapon built for his range. Reach past him with something heavier before he ever gets his hands on the trigger. That doctrine exposed a trap the German high command had built for itself without realizing it. The same emphasis on the individual machine gun that made German infantry so lethal at close range also meant Germany had never developed, and, as the war ground on, never had the industrial spare capacity to develop a true heavy machine gun of its own to match the Browning across every platform. Germany's own aircraft cannon, in the 20mm and later 30mm classes, were genuinely formidable against Allied bombers, but they were complex, expensive, and could not simply be unbolted from a fighter and handed to an infantry squad the way the Browning could move seamlessly between roles. The result was a strange asymmetry that grew wider every year of the war. The weapon German infantry most feared kept turning up in places their own doctrine had no equivalent answer for. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring is reported to have said, later in the war, that he might have won the Battle of Britain if the Luftwaffe had possessed the American .50 caliber Browning for its fighters. An admission, however self-serving, of a gap the German war machine never closed. Add to that an institutional failure at the top. German intelligence consistently underestimated how thoroughly American industry would saturate every unit, on every front, with the same weapon, treating early encounters as isolated incidents rather than the leading edge of a systemic advantage. And beneath the institutional failure sat a colder arithmetic. German machine gun crews, elite and irreplaceable, trained for years in interlocking fire discipline, were being killed and captured faster than the training pipeline behind the front could replace them, while American gunners, simpler to train and drawing on a nearly bottomless supply of the weapon itself, could be replaced almost as fast as they fell. Audie Leon Murphy did not look like a man who would end the war as its most decorated American soldier. Born in 1925 to a sharecropping family in Hunt County, Texas, the seventh of 12 children, he stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed around 110 pounds when he tried to enlist, light enough that both the Marines and the Army's paratroopers turned him away before the infantry finally took him. He had padded his birth year on his enlistment papers to meet the minimum age. What his size hid was a stillness under fire that officers up the chain kept noticing, promotion after promotion, until by January of 1945, he commanded Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, a unit that had already fought its way up through Sicily, Anzio, and southern France. He was not the loudest man in his company and never claimed to be. Those who served with him described someone quiet, watchful, almost unremarkable in camp, the kind of soldier easy to overlook until the shooting started. His battalion commander had come to rely on exactly that quality, not aggression for its own sake, but a cold, exact read of a battlefield under pressure, the same quality that would matter most on the day nobody in his company yet knew was coming. What almost none of them knew, and what would only become public knowledge much later, was that the same young lieutenant photographed calmly directing artillery fire from a shallow ditch would spend the years after the war fighting an entirely different and far more private battle, one the Army had no citation for. Long before Murphy ever touched the gun that would define his war, the weapon had already proven itself in a fight that had nothing to do with infantry combat at all, high over occupied France, in the belly of a B-17. On the 1st of May, 1943, a ball turret gunner named Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith, a difficult, cantankerous 31-year-old from Michigan, whom his own crew barely tolerated, nicknamed Snuffy after a comic strip character, was flying his very first combat mission when German fighters tore his bomber apart over Saint-Nazaire, rupturing fuel lines and setting the fuselage on fire. 3 crewmen bilayed out. Smith climbed free of his disabled turret, found 2 more crewmen too badly wounded to jump, and made a decision in seconds that would define the rest of his life. He stayed. For the next 90 minutes he fought the fire with his hands, tended the wounded, and manned the aircraft's remaining .50 caliber guns against renewed fighter attacks, all inside an airframe that was, quite literally, coming apart underneath him. When the pilot finally put the bomber down in England, it had absorbed more than 3,500 holes from bullets and shrapnel and broke in 2 on landing. Smith became the first enlisted airman of the U.S. Army Air Forces to receive the Medal of Honor. It was proof, delivered 18 months before Murphy's stand and thousands of feet in the air rather than on the ground, that the same weapon and the same willingness to stay at a burning gun position could turn a doomed situation into a survivable one. A lesson the war would repeat in different forms, again and again before it ended. Before this goes any further, it's worth being straight about how a script like this one gets made, because the myths around this weapon run deep and some of them do not hold up. There is a popular claim, repeated constantly online, that German ordnance engineers tried and failed to copy the Browning outright during the war. A claim that overstates what actually happened, since Germany's real obstacle wasn't an inability to reverse engineer a captured weapon. It was an industrial and doctrinal system that had never made room for one like it in the first place. Getting a detail like that right takes actual research, not repetition of the most shared version of the story. And if that kind of rigor is worth something to you, a like on this video is what tells the channel that it is. The German response to the weapon, once it became clear this was not a rare or isolated threat but something they would face on every front for the rest of the war, moved through recognizable stages. Disbelief, then a scramble for intelligence, then new doctrine handed down that never quite closed the gap. Early after-action reports from German units in Tunisia and Sicily described American fire support, with a kind of professional respect German soldiers rarely extended to Allied equipment, noting the weapon's reliability and the sheer volume of ammunition American units seemed able to expend without hesitation. A detail that, more than any single engagement, told German officers something uncomfortable about the industrial gap they were now fighting against. Later intelligence bulletins urged German infantry to avoid bunching in the open, to disperse further from roads where American vehicles could bring the weapon to bear quickly, and to treat any half-track or armored car at range as a potential heavy weapons threat rather than a soft target, tactical adjustments that acknowledged the danger without ever producing a German weapon that could answer it in kind, on the same range of platforms, in the same numbers. By the second half of 1944, the weapon's presence had stopped being a battlefield curiosity and had become a structural fact of the war German soldiers could not train their way around, and a second figure entered the story to prove just how far its reach had spread. Where Murphy represented the weapon in its rawest infantry form, one man, one gun, one desperate afternoon, Smith's earlier action over St. Nazaire had already shown what the same weapon could do stacked 13 high in a single bomber, fired in overlapping fields by gunners who had never met each other before that morning's briefing. By 1944, American bomber formations flying deep into Germany depended on exactly that principle. No single aircraft needed to defend itself alone, because every gun in the formation covered every other aircraft's blind spot, turning individual courage into a defensive network no German fighter pilot could safely fly through without accepting real losses. On the ground, the same logic scaled differently, but just as effectively. The four-gun M16 half-track mount, which soldiers nicknamed the meat chopper for what its combined fire did to an exposed infantry formation, turned an anti-aircraft weapon into one of the most feared ground support systems of the Battle of the Bulge, tearing apart German attacks that tried to cross open ground in the December cold. The strategic proof came into full view during the Ardennes fighting. German commanders who had planned their advance around speed and surprise found American units able to bring concentrated .50 caliber fire onto contested crossroads within minutes, using a weapon light enough to move on a jeep and heavy enough to stop the vehicles trying to force those same crossroads. That speed of response mattered more than any single engagement's body count, because the entire German plan for the offensive depended on moving faster than American reinforcements could react. Every crossroads held by a weapon that could arrive and start firing within minutes was a crossroads the German timetable had not accounted for. And timetables, in an offensive built entirely around speed, were the one thing the plan could not survive losing. One more thing before the story reaches Holtzwihr itself, and it deserves a direct moment rather than a rushed mention at the end. If a video like this is worth 50 minutes of your evening, subscribing costs nothing and tells the channel there's an audience for getting the details right. What happened next, on that frozen field outside Holtzwihr, is the reason this particular story earned its own hour rather than a paragraph in a larger one. The longest single stand any American infantryman made with this weapon during the entire war. Against odds, nobody expected him to survive. By the morning of January 26, 1945, Company B had spent 3 days fighting through the Calmer Pocket, the last significant German foothold on French soil, pushing toward the fortified village of Holtzwihr through the Bois de Riedwihr. Murphy's company had been ground down to a fraction of its strength. Some sources put it as low as 19 effective men out of what should have been well over 100, and he had set up his defensive line across the base of a large U-shaped clearing in the woods, 2 tank destroyers from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, positioned along the road that German armor would have to use if it came, 5 armored cars from the 3rd Reconnaissance Troop screening his right flank, and his own command post dug into a drainage ditch roughly 10 yards behind the rearmost tank destroyer, connected to battalion headquarters a mile back by field telephone. He was told that morning that his promised reinforcements, the 2nd Battalion of the 30th Infantry, would not arrive in time. His orders were simple: hold. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, preceded by an artillery barrage, 6 German tanks and roughly 250 infantrymen, some accounts describe them as elite mountain troops, came out of Holtzwihr directly toward his position. Murphy got on the phone to call in artillery before the first shots even landed. The American tank destroyers opened fire immediately, but their return fire proved largely ineffective against the advancing German armor, and one by one they were knocked out or forced to fall back, their infantry support guns tearing into the oncoming German troops for as long as they lasted, which was not long enough. Murphy ordered his own men to fall back into the deeper woods, judging correctly that his shattered company could not hold the open ground against 6 tanks and a quarter of the attacking force still coming. He stayed forward at his command post, directing artillery by telephone as the German advance closed the distance. Then a German round found the rear tank destroyer and set it burning, its 5-man crew abandoning it for the tree line, and Murphy's carbine ran empty. This is the moment the cold open only showed you the edge of. He had 2 choices in the space of a few seconds: fall back with his men into the woods, which every reasonable calculation told him to do, or climb onto a burning vehicle loaded with fuel and ammunition, in full view of advancing German armor, and use the one weapon still capable of reaching the enemy at range. He chose the second, later admitting only that he believed the German tanks could not press their advance without infantry support close behind them, and that the machine gun was the only tool left that could break that support apart. He climbed onto the hull, put his hands on the grips of the .50 caliber gun mounted there, and opened fire on troops advancing across open, snow-covered ground, in a position exposed to German fire from 3 directions at once. For the next hour, obscured by smoke from the burning vehicle and interrupted only to reload, to duck the concussion of the tank destroyer's own 88mm rounds cooking off inside the wreck, or to call in fresh artillery corrections by phone, Murphy held that ground almost entirely alone. German infantry pressed to within 10 yards of his position at points along the line, close enough that individual men could be seen falling to his fire rather than simply vanishing into the smoke at range. A German squad attempted to work around his right flank, unnoticed, and was cut down before it reached cover. He took a bullet in the leg partway through the engagement and kept firing, later saying almost nothing about the wound at all. Denied infantry support, taking casualties with no cover and no clear path to withdraw, the German attack lost momentum and finally pulled back toward Holtzwihr, not because the tanks had been destroyed, but because the infantry screening them had been stopped cold, and armor without infantry support in terrain like that was armor waiting to be killed at close range by other means. Only when his ammunition finally ran dry did Murphy climb down from the wreck, refuse medical attention for the leg wound, and organize what remained of his company for the counterattack that pushed the Germans back for good, personally directing artillery fire that accounted for a further share of the German casualties that afternoon. The tank destroyer itself was never meant to survive that hour. It had already taken a direct hit before Murphy climbed aboard, its own fuel cells and stored main gun rounds sitting, exposed beneath him the entire time, and more than once the heat from the fire cooking off inside the hull sent concussive shocks through the metal under his boots that had nothing to do with German fire at all. He would later describe the smoke as almost a mercy, thick enough at times to blur his own silhouette from German gunners trying to range in on him, thin enough at others that he could watch individual men fall at ranges close enough to see their faces. Visibility came and went in the same few seconds. Distance closed and opened as German squads pushed forward under covering fire, and then broke for cover when the gun found them. At one point, the field telephone line to battalion headquarters, his only link to the artillery still falling behind Holtzwihr, went briefly silent, and Murphy kept firing without knowing whether the guns a mile back could still hear him. By the time it was over, credible estimates placed the German dead and wounded from that single position at somewhere near 50 men, cut down by one soldier and one machine gun that was never supposed to still be operable. What Murphy's Medal of Honor citation would later call his indomitable courage is a fair description of the man. It is a harder, colder description of the weapon that made that particular kind of one man stand survivable at all, not because the gun made any man brave, but because it gave one determined man the volume and reach to matter against 250. In the months that followed, German field reports from units that had faced concentrated American automatic weapons fire began describing something closer to resignation than tactical analysis, a sense documented across multiple fronts that no adjustment in German small unit doctrine was going to close the specific gap this weapon represented. Where earlier in the war German instructions to infantry had focused on tactical countermeasures, disperse, avoid open ground, treat vehicles as threats at range. By the war's final year, those instructions increasingly acknowledged, in tone if not always in explicit language, that the volume of American automatic fire simply exceeded what German infantry doctrine had been built to survive. Germany's attempted answers came too late and in numbers too small to matter. Heavier automatic cannon reserved almost entirely for the increasingly desperate air defense of the homeland, rather than distributed to infantry, and no equivalent program to put a comparable weapon on every truck, jeep, and tank the way American industry had. By early 1945, German soldiers facing American units on any front were, statistically, more likely than not to be facing the same gun in one of its half-dozen mounted forms, and there was no version of German doctrine written that could make that fact go away. Murphy's own fate, withheld until now, tells its own quiet story about what a war like this one costs even the men who survive it whole. He went on to become the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War, the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts and decorations from France and Belgium besides, and afterward found a second, stranger career as a Hollywood actor, eventually playing himself in the 1955 film adaptation of his own memoir. What the public did not see for decades was the private cost, what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress, which Murphy struggled with for the rest of his life, along with periods of insomnia, depression, and a dependency on prescription sleep medication that he later spoke about publicly, at real professional risk, specifically to push the Army toward taking psychological wounds as seriously as physical ones. He died on May 28, 1971, at the age of 45, in the crash of a private airplane in the mountains of Virginia, killed not by the war that had defined him, but by ordinary bad weather, 26 years after he should have died in a French forest. Those who knew him in his final years described a man who slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow long after the war had ended, who avoided crowded rooms, and who nonetheless kept speaking publicly about what combat had done to him, at a time when almost no other public figure of his stature would use words like these to describe themselves. It cost him something in reputation among men who still believed silence was the only acceptable response to what they had seen. He said it anyway. Maynard Smith's own post-war life carried its own bitter irony, one the Army itself imposed. The first enlisted airman ever awarded the Medal of Honor was demoted to private in December of 1944 for poor performance and disciplinary trouble. His brilliance under fire never quite reconciled with his difficulty following orders when nothing was on fire at all. He came home to a hero's parade despite the demotion, spent the rest of his life in and out of legal trouble, and died in Florida in 1984, at 72, largely out of the public eye that had once celebrated him. Two men, two very different kinds of courage, both undone in their own ways by the peace they had fought to bring about. Behind both of them stood a system too large for any single name to carry, and it is worth pausing on the men the newspapers never printed. For every Murphy holding a ditch alone and every Smith fighting a fire at 20,000 feet, there were tens of thousands of gunners, loaders, armorers, and maintenance crews who never fired a shot anyone wrote home about. Keeping a weapon this heavy and this hungry for ammunition running across every theater of the war. There were women on American production lines building receivers and barrels by the millions, ordnance depots keeping belts of ammunition, moving forward faster than German logistics could move replacement weapons of any kind, and armorers in the field who kept 80-year-old design principles running reliably in mud, sand, and snow, with nothing more than routine maintenance. The famous stands were the visible edge of that system, not the system itself, and the system is the actual reason the weapon showed up on every front rather than remaining a rare and dramatic exception. Somewhere in a report nobody remembers today is a quartermaster sergeant who kept a company supplied with belted ammunition through a winter when trucks routinely got stuck axle-deep in mud, and an armorer who could field strip and reassemble the weapon blind, because he had done it so many times he no longer needed to look at his own hands. None of them received a citation. All of them are part of the reason the citation exists for the men who did. Laid out in order, the turning points run cleanly enough to follow without commentary. April 1918, General Pershing demands a heavier American machine gun. October 1918, the first prototype, built on captured German ballistics, fires on a test range 1 month before the armistice ends the war that inspired it. 1933, the finished weapon enters service as the M2. May 1943, Maynard Smith proves the gun's value in the air over St. Nazaire. Through 1944, the weapon spreads across every American platform on every front of the European war. January 26, 1945, Audie Murphy holds Holtzwihr alone. By early 1945, German field reports acknowledge a gap in firepower doctrine that will not close before the war ends. 4 factors, taken together, explain why German soldiers came to fear this particular weapon more than any other the Americans carried. First, the machine itself. A design robust enough to survive decades of hard use with only incremental changes, powerful enough to threaten light armor and low-flying aircraft with the same round that could also support infantry at long range. Second, the doctrine built around it, putting one weapon on every kind of platform, so that no branch of the American military and no domain of the war, air, land, or sea, was without it. Third, the reach. An effective range that let American gunners engage German positions from outside the range at which German small arms could answer back, changing the terms of firefights that earlier in the war had been fought at close, brutal range. Fourth, the system standing behind all of it. An industrial base capable of producing roughly 2 million of these guns during the war years alone, alongside the ammunition, the training pipeline, and the logistics to keep them fed, at a scale Germany's own war economy, stretched thin on every front, simply could not match. Put those four together against Germany's actual capacity to replace trained infantry and specialized machine gun crews, and the arithmetic becomes stark. American gunners, simpler and faster to train, backed by a nearly inexhaustible supply of the weapon itself, could be replaced far faster than the elite German crews being worn down opposing them. Here is the honest footnote this format insists on, because the popular version of this story overstates parts of it. The most repeated claim, that this was simply the best machine gun of the war, full stop, unmatched by anything the Germans fielded, oversimplifies a more complicated picture. In pure rate of fire, the German MG-42 outpaced it by a wide margin, and German infantry doctrine built around that weapon was, on its own terms, extremely effective at close range for most of the war. The Browning's own weaknesses were real. It was heavy enough that moving it by hand across broken ground was genuinely difficult. Its headspace and timing required careful adjustment, or the weapon could fire dangerously out of specification. And its earlier slow fire, versions before wartime improvements, had real limitations against fast-moving targets. And crucially, the reversal this script describes was never a single-weapon story. American artillery, air superiority, and sheer numerical advantage in men and materiel did at least as much to break German resistance as any one machine gun, however widely distributed. What remains true, and what the exaggerated version sometimes obscures, is the specific and narrower claim the record actually supports. No German soldier on any front of the war could go very long without encountering this particular weapon in one form or another, and Germany never built anything that matched its reach across every domain of the fighting at once. The decisive factor in the end was less a single brilliant piece of tactics than an industrial and organizational one. The ability to put the same reliable weapon everywhere, all at once, faster than the enemy could adapt. Ma Deuce outlived nearly everyone connected to her origin story. John Browning, the 62-year-old gunsmith who first scaled up his own .30 caliber design to answer Pershing's 1918 demand, never saw a single German soldier face the weapon he built to threaten them. He died on November 26, 1926, at his workbench in the FN factory in Herstal, Belgium, the same country, by grim coincidence, where American soldiers would later fight to push German forces back out of during the war his weapon would help decide. He was working. At the moment his heart finally gave out, not on the machine gun at all but on a new pistol design, finished years later by another engineer entirely. The man who built one of the most consequential weapons of the 20th century died without ever knowing what it would become. The weapon he left behind outlasted every replacement program the American military tried to build for it. Heavier, more complex systems developed decades later, in the 1950s, the 2000s, and beyond, each one eventually canceled or retired while the original design simply kept working. It remains standard equipment in the American military today, more than a century after the requirement that produced it, mounted on vehicles Browning could never have imagined, still built to essentially the same operating principle he worked out on a drafting table before most of the men who would one day carry it were even born. The doctrine it enabled, spreading one dependable, powerful weapon across every platform rather than perfecting a dozen specialized ones, outlived the war that proved it and became a standing principle of American military logistics for the rest of the century. Veterans on both sides who returned to places like Holtzwihr decades later described the same strange sensation. A quiet farm field, snow gone, the tree line grown back in, nothing to mark what had happened there except memory and, eventually, a small plaque. The weapon changed. The idea behind it did not have to. If this kind of story, the object behind the moment, not just the moment itself, is what keeps you coming back, Subscribing and turning notifications on is how you make sure you don't miss the next one. And this channel exists specifically to keep finding stories like this one, where the real history is stranger and more exact than the shorthand version everyone already knows. One thing worth sitting with after everything you've just heard. Murphy climbed onto that burning wreck almost entirely because a weapon happened to still be usable within arm's reach. Ask yourself, in the comments, whether you think the outcome at Holtzwihr says more about the man or about the machine that gave one man the reach of an entire platoon.